rights and what we will continue to do. And number two, what particular forms of collaboration we can forge with civil society, including unions, on the issue. So to begin with, a bit of good news. Our new Executive Director, Michelle Bachelet, who's the new Under-Secretary General for UN Women, has identified women's economic empowerment as a key core strategic area for UN Women's engagement. And women's migration has been identified as not just a program, a whole section under the Economic Empowerment and MDGs cluster. And our role in the migration section is to provide lead support on gender equality and women's empowerment to national priorities, to the work of the UN system through the GMG, the Global Migration Group, and other interagency formations of the UN at country level and at regional level, and to support intergovernmental processes on the gender equality and women's empowerment dimension of migration. That will be UN Women's niche on migration. So what have we done in the past on migration? Our work on migration really began with the regional program, the Asia Pacific Arab States Regional Program on Empowering Women Migrant Workers. This began in 2001, and the purpose of this program was to catalyze gender-sensitive policy environments, institutional environments, and to build the capacity of women migrant workers, groups, and associations to claim their rights and entitlements. This is a 10-country program in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Arab states. Our focus is on poor women migrant workers, particularly domestic workers. And what are some of the key results of this program? Well, at the level of policy and legislation, at the global level, we have worked very, very closely with the CEDAW committee, which in 2008, November, adopted a CEDAW general recommendation on migration. And we provided technical and financial assistance to the development of this GR, this general recommendation. We also provided or played a convening role, getting NGOs, women migrant workers groups, academics, and the like, to provide input to the development of this general recommendation. So in a sense, what we did was facilitate civil society participation in international standard setting. This GR is very important for several reasons. Number one, it lays out the women's rights standards, the human rights standards from a gender equality, women's rights perspective on migration. It provides very detailed guidance to governments on the kinds of measures they need to introduce to support women migrant workers' rights. And thirdly, in a sense, although any provision in CEDAW can address women migrant workers' concerns, this GR really places women migrant workers' rights up front within the CEDAW process, and in a sense institutionalizes it within the CEDAW process. And we've been doing work together with NGOs and others on capacity strengthening to use the CEDAW process more effectively. Secondly, at the national level, we have supported national governments and civil society organizations to formulate and to introduce gender-sensitive legislation on migration. And here we have the case of Nepal at the national level, Indonesia, where we worked with civil society partners at the national level, and very definitely at the local level in Blitar. And I want to say that these pieces of legislation have introduced some good provisions for women, such as women's independent migration, the lifts or the elimination of bans on women's out-migration, pre-departure training programs which are rights-based for women migrant workers, gender-sensitive information dissemination, and the like. Thirdly, we have worked with national governments. The example I want to give is Jordan, for instance, to review and reform their labor laws to include and recognize domestic workers. And we worked with the Ministry of Labor in Jordan who introduced a rights-based, a standard, unified, legally enforceable, rights-based contract for domestic workers. But our challenge, the contract is a very strong rights-based contract, but our challenge is monitoring the implementation of that contract and really ensuring that that contract works in the interest of domestic workers. And here I have to say there's a big gap between policy and practice, and we need to move on the ball and move this agenda forward more strongly. We have also worked at the national level on media campaigns, for instance. And here I want to cite the example of Nepal, where we worked with media groups, with professionals within the media, with NGOs working on media issues, with government. So it was a multi-sectoral engagement to actually facilitate or to support a multimedia campaign that was print media, the TV, radio, on protecting women migrant workers' rights and lifting bans on women's out-migration. And I think quite honestly we could say that this was the beginning, the precursor to changing the whole discourse in Nepal on the issue of migration, because the program in Nepal was actually introduced at a time when there were bans placed on women's out-migration as a safeguard to trafficking. And this multimedia program, in a sense, also supported or was the, formed the first steps towards the government thinking about introducing legislation in Nepal. And lastly, we have worked with women migrant workers associations, 7 districts in Nepal and 6 districts in Indonesia at the local level, building their capacity to strengthen their rights and their entitlements. And the examples that I want to give are, number 1, they have worked with local governments to have gender-sensitive and sex-disaggregated databases at the village level. So they know who's going out, where they are going, for what jobs, and it's sex-disaggregated. And they have used this information to actually help track down women who've lost contact with their families. Second, they have worked with local governments to develop village information dissemination centers. They have worked with the Brawijaya University in Indonesia to develop pre-departure training programs for women migrant workers, to test these programs, run these programs, and returned women migrant workers both in Nepal and in Indonesia at the local level are resource persons in these pre-departure training programs and in the community awareness raising that we do on the costs of migration and also the benefits of migration. The local communities, including women, run information dissemination through radio programs, and they have a call-in service to ask for information on how they can use legal channels for migration. And this information dissemination is to promote the rights of women migrant workers throughout the migration process and to promote safe migration. And lastly, we've done paralegal training for women and men communities as well as returned migrant workers, and they are using this training to actually handle cases of grievance redress. So wage cuts, non-payment of wages, abuse, and the like. And we've also been able to link these groups to NGOs providing these services, including trauma counseling and, via abuse, addressing situations of abuse of returned women migrant workers. So in a nutshell, that's what we've done so far. We've also done a lot of CDAW training for governments and for NGOs, and we worked with recruiting agents to develop codes of conduct. But here again, I have to say, it's a very tricky issue, and after developing those codes of conduct, we haven't moved on the implementation of those codes, and this is something we need to take on board very seriously. What are we doing now? Our current global strategy that has just been addressed, and I want to say that we have built on the lessons of the Asia-Pacific program to develop a global strategy, a UN women-wide strategy now on migration. And there are 2 pillars to this strategy. The first is to focus on gender-responsive migration governance, and something that is part of that is also to engage with monitoring and oversight mechanisms to ensure accountability to the concerns of women migrant workers. So what exactly are we proposing to do? Number 1, knowledge generation, research, data, and dissemination of this information, this analysis in accessible ways, and to use this to actually help develop policies, plans, programs, and budgets that are gender sensitive, because you need resource allocations and expenditure on women migrant workers' concerns. Secondly, to facilitate gender sensitive provision of services and institutional delivery of services in a gender sensitive manner. Thirdly, we want to work very closely with women migrant worker organizations and NGOs supporting women migrant workers, facilitating capacity development